Today I want to talk specifically about Ghanaian learners of Swahili in Tanzania. And this is part of a larger project that I did. Looking in that classroom, you can see that there are a number of other students who may not be readily identified as Ghanaian per whatever your idea of Ghanaian might be, right? So, just looking really quickly, we've got one of the Ghanaian students sort of just in the front of the classroom. I think she's doing a presentation. And also in the class are students from China, from various locations in China, and also Finland, and also Austria. So the classroom in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania is very varied, let's say that. And there's a lot going on. So I'm talking today about race, color, and language, and some of these ideas of ownership. And I think what's really interesting about this work is that there's not really a lot of work done on students coming from various countries across the African continent to do study abroad. And we also have a language like Swahili, which has this larger history of being wrapped up in ideas of Pan-African unity. It's one of the only sort of indigenous continental African languages that are used by the African Union, that is very ubiquitous outside of the African continent. And so there's a lot that you think about when you think about Swahili. So I just want to kind of get into it. Let's see how this works. So just really quickly, I'm giving some pseudonyms to some of these kids up here. And we'll know her as Ivy, her as, you can sort of see her outline, Happiness, Gladys, and then Felix. Felix we won't really talk to today, unfortunately, because he was off doing his own thing. He was hanging with the dudes, as he probably should have been doing, right? All right, so the top is a little cut off here, but I wanted to share something that Gladys says in one of my interviews with her, and she said, I got into Swahili when I received my admission letter, and I started to inquire about the course, and I was told it's even a language. So I didn't think of taking it that far. As time went on, I was falling in love with the language itself, though. And what I think is really interesting here is that you have these students who are now abroad. They're 3 years into studying the language at their university in Ghana, in Legon. And, but when they came to the language, they didn't do it by choice, really. What's interesting is the admission process at the University of Ghana, like a lot of admission processes around the world, is kind of you get sorted by your test scores and everything. So they'll assign you courses. And one of the stereotypes in Ghana that I've been told by other students of mine, current students of mine, is that you get into Swahili, it's because you didn't get your first choice, right? So that already takes the language down a notch, kind of status and prestige-wise, right? And talking to the students, it was that they wanted to study French, or they wanted to study something entirely different, and they got locked into Swahili. But the interesting thing, I think, is that through that process, something changed for them. And so talking to Eloise here, who's not pictured, she said, well, I didn't know much about Swahili, so I was cool with it. Right? But I didn't think I would take it that far. Students ask you, what can you use Swahili for? And I said, I don't know. Right? So there's this disconnect, right? They may be also on the continent, but they're on the entire other side. They're some 3,000 miles away. So, you really get a sense here of how large African can mean, I think. But then also that learning languages is really caught up in this utility and these instrumental motivations and being able to imagine yourself in the future. And so that's why I kind of like this concept of investment, right? Yeah, let's go there. And here's another quote here. Top get kind of cut off, but really what they're saying is, after 3 years of study, I finally get to go abroad and interact with the natives, right? This is their terminology. So we'll say native speaker, perhaps. The government fully sponsors only 5 students to do this, and it makes you feel like studying Swahili is important. So finally, after reaching a certain level of proficiency, starting to feel like, hey, it's worth it. Okay, so at some point while I was there, The Ghanaian students would always come in with like some beautiful African fabrics, but in different Western patterns, like I'm wearing right now, like a skirt above the knee, which is actually kind of a cultural no-no in Tanzania, but very savvy for the West Coast. So she came in with her blended hybrid t-shirt, and I was like, whoa, that's so cool, I gotta take a picture. So on the front end, it says Swahili Students Association, and on the back, it says Kiswahili kwa Umoja wa Afrika. And I thought that was so interesting because it's clearly got a Pan-African message. And I feel like this is part of what's seen as part of the utility of learning Swahili, but only after you get streamed into Swahili and not by choice, right? And what's interesting here too is that Swahili has this older history in Ghana that I think is very unknown and very not trendy for contemporary Ghanaian youth. When Ghana became independent in 1957, it was the first country on the African continent to become independent. And Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first inaugural president of that country, said, hey, we're gonna boost our Swahili profile and we're gonna do radio broadcasts on the national radio in Swahili 6 hours a day. So that's pretty tremendous, right, in the 50s, 60s. And it connects to the relationships that world leaders were having with the Tanzanian country at the time. Big sort of socialist, but also Pan-Africanist leader with Swahili out in front. So here, what I'm doing is I'm kind of connecting this language learning focus that I have, but to larger issues in the study abroad context. All right, so here's somebody who believes in investment, put this out there, saying that investment in the target language is also an investment in the learner's own social identity, right? And that this changes across time and space. And so literally we have time and we have space, right? We've got a span of 3 years or more. And then we also have these students moving from West Africa to East Africa for this study. And they will be there for a year throughout this process. So here I am talking to them in their sort of halfway point. So again, just to give you an idea, Africa's pretty big, right? It's pretty big. So 1957, Ghana becomes independent, and it's 1961 that Tanzania becomes independent. And you notice here, Ghana is actually 3 times smaller than Tanzania. So, I mean, it's really amazing. And I was able to find some interesting information about the Ghanaian Swahili program itself. And so just saying that, you know, they're taking third-year students for this one-year study abroad program, pretty phenomenal, right? And they've been running this program since the mid-1960s. So there's a lot of history here, a lot of history of cooperation. So just some quick pictures so that you could kind of get a sense of what's going on in Dar es Salaam. You've got the student dorms here, the Department of Swahili, Kiswahili as it is within the language, and a mad mix of different culture and confluence and urbanity, or rather urbanness. A couple other pictures for you, just so you can see that we have the coast and we have modernity, but it's all sort of mixed in. Billboards with Swahili abound, all kinds of stuff is happening. And so back to the classroom, right? Here you have another view of the classroom. You can see that it really is a confluence here. And what I think is so interesting about this classroom is it's really a confluence. Did I say that already? I meant microcosm, yeah. So here you can sort of see my little mini setup. Got the recorder there where I hang out. And up here is where most of the action happens, but the tables are all fixed. It's really kind of your standard setup. So let's just go into the classroom. So what's interesting is when I have my recorder set up, sometimes I kind of got into a habit of like starting it before the teacher would get in there because I didn't want to miss what the teacher sort of said at the very beginning to like greet the students or capture all that activity. And when I went back to listen to the recording, I realized I caught a private conversation. So let's listen to their conversation. All right. So here, the ladies are kind of just chatting amongst themselves, and it took me a couple years to run down some students here on stateside who's speakers of Twi and Ga, who could listen to this recording for me, because I had the intuition that there was something that I could not understand. And they listened to the stuff, we listened to it together, and we came up with this mix. So what's interesting is that at the beginning, they're talking about Hausa, another language, Ga, another language, and then also tree. And so Gladys started commenting, Hausa is also a language that's progressing. I learned Ga, you know, Ga's out there too. Somebody else is on the recording, just an interloper. But then she continues, she says, well, they don't teach tree here. But she uses this phrase, omunchure, and then she says, but you can get it at the white universities, the universities abroad, the non-African universities, the universities outside of Africa. And she uses this word, abronchure. And so then Happiness responds, she says, well, they don't respect us, or they don't respect Omwamwadie. You should come to the well-established universities. You know, I think she's kind of talking to them. She's like, you are full of yourself. Talking to like Tanzanians or those who don't respect. Ohio University, Pennsylvania, Stanford, Berkeley. And then Gladys starts to think about this future, thinking about these other universities abroad where tree is offered, and thinks of herself as a potential tree instructor or Swahili instructor as well. She's like, I hope to search for tree, but maybe that school will have it. Tree and Swahili will be good for us. So one of the things I'm seeing emerging in this talk is this term, this definite term, abronchure, but also this idea that, hey, look, in Ghana, we offer Swahili. How come you don't offer tree, right? It's this kind of reciprocal idea of what Africanness and respect for Africanness is, an idea of Pan-Africanism as well. And I think it's interesting that they know, they're savvy, they know where tree is being taught around the world, and where also Swahili is being taught. And they see a lot of activity here in the States, right? A continuation of this conversation, Ivy sort of responds to this idea of Swahili and tree being good for us, and she says, but what if you go and you don't really enjoy tree? You don't really want to do it for your career or something. And then Happiness says, well, I'll be into Swahili for sure, right? So it's this connectedness with Swahili after this 3-year process of kind of doing the slog. So a little bit later on, Ivy makes a comment, you know, she's like, well, shouldn't we basically be starting class already? Like, where is everybody, right? And then Gladys says, well, you would think that the whites, the non-Africans, they must be working since they're not here, basically is the idea. And then she's like, oh, they're coming, right? And they actually do start to trickle in. But here again, this word abrufo. And I had to do some learning on this because I'm not a tree speaker, I'm a Swahili speaker. So my students were kind of cluing me in to the idea that there is a worldview being represented here. And I think what's really interesting too is that you get into understanding, I think, more about what blackness means, what Africanness means. You know, as we're looking at these different settings of study abroad, we're realizing that study abroad is actually an opportunity to see these things in confluence and in steady juxtaposition. And so, you know, I'm looking at racialization. I'm understanding that race is a process that's historically situated. I'm looking here at discursive configurations of difference as they play out in different locations on the continent. And just again, so you can see this, right? Accra's coastal, Dar es Salaam's coastal, but they're on opposite ends. And in the classroom, right, we have our Ghanaian students, we've got our Tanzanian students, but we've also got students from other places around the world. And I would say, you know, that was one of the most exciting things about doing this work, was seeing who was in that classroom. I had no idea until I got there what was going to be going on. And I probably sat in and hung out with at least 4 to 5 different study abroad programs that were hanging in Dar es Salaam during that time. Programs from St. Olaf, from SIT, programs you're familiar with. And so really quickly, just a rundown of some of these terms. We begin to see that the Ghanaians have their terms, but so do the Tanzanians. So here's something that is interesting. Talking with one of the Swahili TAs there at the university, and getting a sense that there's also a worldview from the Tanzanian side. They may not use the word Abruchiri, Abrufo, or Obruni, but they use the word Mzungu and Wazungu, and this is something that's experienced by students when they come from abroad. And here she's telling me that the word Mzungu, because I asked her, I said, like, what is this word? It's my little naive question to get her to say something to me, right? But she's like, yeah, it's for people from Europe. It's for white people. And, there's an exception maybe for Americans that look like us, but even there, I think that was a tough question for her. And, when I say, well, so what's with, what color is it maybe, if you could connect it to a color? She says, well, I don't know, that's kind of a tough question, but like it's the color you'd see if you went to Uganda or Tanzania or Ghana or, any other African place. And then it comes to thinking about Libya, because there are students also from Libya in that context too. And she sort of says, well, technically, geographically, yeah, they're African, but are they the same kind of African? No. And I think what's really interesting here is that this worldview sort of posits a very strict dichotomy, right? Either you're black or you're white. And if you're white, then you're really this category of outsider and foreigner. And I think this is interesting because all of our students coming from the States and elsewhere, this is what they encounter when they come to a different context, and they have to negotiate this, right? This includes Chinese students, students from Korea. We also have students from Korea there, Japan. This includes basically anybody who is not seen from the inside of the Tanzanian perspective as African or such. So really quickly, just a couple of closers. The Ghanaian students reflecting in our interview, that because they share this blackness, this surface blackness, that they are misrecognized as Tanzanian, and people sort of say, well, speak like a Tanzanian. And there's this idea that if you're speaking English, right, then you're like snobbish on the street. And so that's kind of something they have to negotiate. So she says, I'm a Ghanaian, but she says it in Swahili, mimi ni Mghana, right? And I think still on the street, there's this idea that, no, you must be joking, you're probably lying to me, like, why are you saying this stuff, right? But then they also have this other developed conception of what being African is, and I think this is interesting too. Being African is not necessarily about the color, they say. It's someone who appreciates the value of Pan-Africanism. Some blacks, they don't feel happy about being in Africa. They are not African. You have to be proud. And so I think, this is part of the conception they have that develops while they're in the study abroad context, and it gets sort of put into acute development there. Finally, there's this little last bit of conversation from that private bit that I recorded. And I think it's sort of interesting. Happiness is sort of just breaking into Swahili all of a sudden. And she starts to sort of think, she starts to sort of paint a picture of like using Swahili back in the Ghanaian context. And she's like, okay, I'll be speaking Swahili, or they'll be speaking Swahili on the minibus, and they'll say, unajua, blah, 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 right? And then somebody will say, well, where are they from? Where are they from? These Swahili speakers. And so she says, well, you'll be talking, but at least you'll get these Ghanaian foods afterwards. And you'll even get parachichi. And what's interesting is that she uses the Swahili word for avocado instead of like a tree or Ga word or even ewe word for avocado. So what I kind of pick up on this, get from this is that, Swahili is part of her conception. And she's already thinking about the issues she's gonna face when she goes back home and she wants to be casual and informal in a normal public setting using Swahili. It's gonna be weird, but she wants to do it. Finally, I'm thinking about crossing and how this might connect, right? Thinking about these liminal spaces, these identities that are fluid, or trying to be non-binary in that sense. And my last reflections are that, really I'm thinking about these confluences and conceptions of blackness and whiteness. I think it's really interesting. On opposite ends of the continent, you have similar worldviews that are binary. I think that speaks to colonial pasts, and it speaks to something that we need to be aware of when we're thinking about the contemporary context and contemporary modern African identity, whatever that is. And just this idea of mixing your future imaginings of your professional language self with whatever existing racialized identities there are in the space, I think is really kind of complicated. So I'm continuing to think about it. But finally, I just want to say a Madase and a Asante, Asante being Swahili, Madase being Tree, to my students who helped me out. So that's it. Thank you.